and for the Esther Plus conference for inviting me to present my research. Basically, I'll be talking about the Jordan River. First of all, one thing that I'll be discussing is the fault line between two different types of ways of talking about the Jordan River and the environment in general. I kind of divide, in that sense, I'm trying to displace the concept of what environment is and how we connect water as being part of the environment, or as being a commodity, or as being an element, a symbol, or a motif in our national identity. So I kind of look at how environment is enacted in different discourse in the Jordan River, specifically contrasting the ways that it is explained in Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territory of the West Bank. In terms of, I divide these into analytical discourses, which are basically economic, scientific, and kind of realist narratives of more like on what's seen as cannot necessarily be argued, something that is presented more as fact and as undeniable evidence of something, and then at the same, and that's more, I take that as like a quantitative sort of approach, and then I divide the other brand of discourse or category of discourses as affective, in the sense that they're more qualitative, they can be negotiated and explained, and are generally seen as something that can be argued for, against, and changed, which is like involves historical narratives, religious narratives, narratives of national identity and identity politics. My question is where these discourses overlap and how they challenge and reinforce each other when they overlap. And I'm going to look at this on three levels, which is the regional, through transport and negotiations, on the national level, through domestic policy making, and on the local level, through community level engagement and household attitudes and behaviors. So now, why is the Jordan River important? It is in a pretty tough neighborhood, and that makes the Jordan River Basin quite important in terms of just larger regional security, and also so it has, in that sense, a very important geopolitical component. As you see here, the Jordan River starts up in the Golan Heights in Syria and the Don and Banias rivers up in Lebanon. Then it goes down, the upper Jordan River is the part that goes down to the Sea of Galilee, or the Sea of Many Names, because it's also called the Lake of Tiberias, and it just has a lot of names, depending on who you're talking to, if you're talking to Palestinians, Jordanians, or Israelis. And then this part is called the Lower Jordan River, and that is the one that I'll mainly be focusing on. And that runs as a border between Jordan and Israel, and then finishes off into the Dead Sea. I first became interested in this when I was interning with Friends of Earth Middle East during my semester abroad in Jordan. I was working with them on their Jordan River Rehabilitation Project. Friends of Earth Middle East is a quite unusual organization in that they have offices in Tel Aviv, Bethlehem, and Amman. And so they try to kind of bring Palestinian, Israeli, and Jordanian environmentalists all together to collaborate on environmental issues and get them kind of to the top of the agenda in their separate domestic spheres. And in that sense, it was interesting, how are they making this transport or collaboration when that's not actually happening on the higher level, and how are they trying to enact it on the community level and on the higher level through their emphasis on rehabilitating the Jordan River. Then in terms of like affective importance, what I discovered was that there's credible cultural dissonances, I call it, but like the cultural demographics of the region are quite complicated, and in a sense that in Israel, of course, after World War II, there was a influx of Jews, specifically from Europe. They brought, European culture, European ideas after spending centuries there, and then there was also the revival of Hebrew, which affected the discourse. They needed to invent several new time terms, and Hebrew became a different sort of language that was used in the context of it representing a nation of Israel. And they also created a specific discourse on how environment was discussed in the Jordan River, and introduced a new type of way of talking about the region. Palestinians then became a diaspora. This prompted a whole kind of glorification almost of the natural resources of the Palestinian territories, such as emphasis on olive trees and oranges as motifs for the people. And at the same time, within the Palestinian territories, they became more conservative, more isolated, and a different kind of politics and discourse around the environment evolved. In Jordan, they have experienced influxes of refugees that have changed the way that they kind of negotiate what is Jordanian, what is not. In a sense, from Syria, from the Palestinian territories first, and then in from Iraq, and then now from Syria. And this has just changed how Jordanians connect with their territory, or how the people who live in Jordan, which are now more than half of them are refugees or immigrants, they feel a different connection to the land and to the territory, and therefore may feel different allegiances to in terms of protecting it. Then in terms of religion, there's also conflicting religions on all sides, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, and these are also enacted in many ways, but not necessarily in environmental discourse. And I do have a small part of my paper that discusses how religious discourse can be involved in talking about the environment in the region, but I don't think that I'll have time to discuss that in this presentation. So my methodology was that I interviewed 9 targeted individuals from environmental ministries in Jordan and Israel, from representatives of Friends of the Earth Middle East in the Tel Aviv and the Amman office, and then I also spoke to religious specialists on environmental ethics and local families, which I lived with, and kind of did participant observation, had informal discussions about the Jordan River with them. I also draw my research from a number of disciplines, such as environmental anthropology, political ecology, and discourse analysis. This is a photo of me interviewing some youth who came to the Sharaban bin Hosni Eco Park, which I will mention later on, which is in the Jordan River Valley. And these are Jordanian youth. We were kind of teaching about solar power, and during our breaks in between, I would ask them more generally about what their thoughts were about the Jordan River and the Jordanian environment. Now I'm going to go into some of my arguments. At the regional level, there's, in terms of looking at the analytical discourses, as I call them, there's a balance of power, in a sense that interpreting natural resources as an element of power, and kind of something that is up for grabs that you can use to your advantage in your power play, and then that kind of and that concept that politicians have and diplomats have on the higher level negotiating table, and it's more strategically thought. And then in terms of, there's this question of who's a riparian and who's not. A riparian is someone who's on the banks of a river, or considered to be eligible to or be allowed access to that body of water. And there's been a disagreement between Jordan and Israel on whether Jordan is a riparian to the Sea of Galilee or not. Right now, Israel claims that it's not, and so less water is allocated to Jordan from the Sea of Galilee than it is to Israel. And there's an increasing water shortage in Jordan, and Israel does not have as big of a problem with it because they also have expensive desalination facilities that they've partly been able to do because of just the investment and the capacity that they have that Jordan doesn't necessarily have. So that's also in terms of politics, economics, finance, those sort of more hard power capabilities. And in terms of also, then in terms of comparing Israeli discourse on water and then Palestinian discourse, Israelis might talk about water allocation and kind of that they're working towards equitable water allocation necessarily, while the Palestinians see it more as an aggressive water grab. You might be familiar with the separation wall that's being built in the West Bank. Well, one thing that it's doing is that it's kind of, some interpret it as it's being shutting out some of the water wells and things, and from the Palestinian side and moving them over to the Israeli side. And the Palestinians see this as a water grab. and bringing more like of emotionally charged words rather than something more polished and diplomatic as the Israelis kind of use in terms of using the word allocation. In terms of affective discourses, it's important to recognize the national identity that is at stake for these countries who are trying to negotiate their claims over the river and its water supply. In terms of, in Jordan, for example, they differentiate between East Bank and West Bank Jordanians. That the West Bank, they're the ones from Palestine, they're the refugees. The East Bank Jordanians are the real Jordanians. And there is this whole then tension between the East Bank and the West Bank. So national identity is built around the river and in relation to the river. In essence, also having a river as a border creates tensions as well that are enacted through their discourse around the Jordan River. Then there are also stagnant alliances in the sense that the bonds that have been made in past have kind of developed into the Arab world against the West in many ways, and that's how at least Jordan Palestinians often interpret it on the higher level. And then the overlap occurs in the sense that there is no resolution. They're having different conversations about the same thing. And if there is a resolution, there's a lack of implementation. And now I'm going to look at that more on the micro-level processes. I will not have that much time to go over my domestic policymaking part of my study, but I'll just quickly point to just the environmental ministries. And I thought it was interesting to kind of see the corresponding dates between the way the titles of the ministries in terms of just seeing how they are phrasing their approach and their kind of attention to these areas. So for example, in 1988, in the same year, Israel started a Ministry for Environmental Protection and Jordan started a Ministry for Water and Irrigation. Water and irrigation, more of like an analytical discourse. Environmental protection, more of an affective discourse. Are they a response to each other? Are they talking about the same thing? How could they collaborate on the Jordan River if they seem to be talking about entirely different things? In 1996, we see that Israel starts a Ministry for National Infrastructure, the same year that Palestinian National Authority in the West Bank starts a Ministry of Environmental Affairs. Environmental affairs, more affective, more something that can be negotiated. National infrastructure, hard, structural, something that cannot be removed or argued against, but something that is necessary. So I just thought that was kind of interesting, and there you can kind of see the contrasting discourses and contemplate whether they are actually having the same conversation on the higher transporter level. In terms of on the ground, I had some interviews with people from Kibbutz Lotan in Israel, and they kind of explained to me that they saw permaculture and environmental initiatives as a vehicle for promotion of Jewish values. So in Israel, it was kind of, the focus on environment and discourse on environment was very religiously charged. In the Shada Ibn Hasni Eco Park, which the picture is from there, once again from the workshops that we held with these youth, it was kind of looking more at teaching Jordanians why and how to care about Jordan. It was more about building up national identity in a place where not many people feel tethered to their territory. And down in the Auja Environmental Center in the West Bank, it was more that the Palestinians were aiming as an isolated population. Not many people go to the West Bank. They wanted to kind of appeal to an international audience to get their voice out there, and that's why they have a huge emphasis on ecotourism. At the community level, the most micro level that I'm going to look at, and probably most interesting to anthropologists. Okay, 5 minutes. This is my next last slide.
Perfect.
This is in terms of the relationship between identity and nature. I saw that this was enacted in quite interesting ways in Jordan, the West Bank, and Israel. In terms of Jordan, there's an encouraging movement towards urbanization from the villages to the cities. And even in a city like Amman, people say 50 years ago it was just a small city. People still feel connected to their villages, but they're living in these huge urban centers where there are no parks. There's not really a culture around parkland, and even though there are initiatives to plant trees, those trees are usually planted in the middle of the sidewalks, discouraging people from pedestrian walking. So in essence, it's kind of pushing people out of the public space and into the private space, kind of forcing them to interact in these kind of private built environments rather than out in sort of a natural environment. And there are some, so there's some discourse on how that they just, and you all probably know the tragedy of the commons and have it kind of sharing that environmental commons, that concept. Well, in Jordan, if they're not connected to that commons, that idea of sharing nature, then they might not feel as committed to caring for it, protecting it. And so I've seen that they kept immaculate homes, but they didn't care about kind of throwing things away out the moment that they went outside of their door or outside of their compound. It was quite a drastic juxtaposition of just the cleanliness in the private space, but complete disregard for any sort of cleanliness on the outside. In Palestinian, in terms of the Palestinians, they kind of, as I said, they kind of interacted, they attached identity to nature very closely. There was less of a disattachment and more of an attachment. They looked at, how the olive trees were representative of the Palestinian people, and therefore they did not, and that's become a motif for the entire diaspora, and even in their claims, again, the separation wall, that they're going over and keep working on these olive groves despite the Israelis stopping them. And there's this whole discourse of how these natural resources and how the Jordan River's water is sort of attached to them. This also relates to, in a sense, one thing that I saw in Palestinian discourse was that they even used to talk about water as a hostage to conflict, and as in that water in the Jordan River was partial to the Palestinians in this conflict, and almost in a way personifying the river. And in terms of Israel, Israel took it kind of as, by working the land and making it green and attaching their Jewish identity in a more hands-on way, they would be more legitimate owners of this land. And in essence, they also had, and there was the discourse too of just, okay, I just lost where I was, but in Israel, there's the idea of the public, that everything is shared by the Jewish people, that this holy land is shared by all Jewish people, and all Jewish people are welcome to it all over the world. And in essence, that created this whole movement to work the land together, the kibbutz movement, and that there should be less private space, and even children should be shared as they are in kibbutz. So in essence, in Israel, it was the immediate opposite to Jordan in terms of that they emphasized the public space rather than the private space, and they tried to create lots of parkland around the Knesset in Jerusalem. They created an enormous park. And perhaps this was in contrast to, or in response to, the kind of Palestinian culture that had been there that didn't really include that many parks, or included them in more private spaces rather than public spaces in the culture. And then finally, these are just basic recommendations that I give in terms of, I go to a school of international affairs, so we're encouraged to make policy recommendations. So these are just brief, I can just read them out. That on the higher level transport negotiations, if they blend analytical, emotionally driven, quantitative driven arguments with affective, emotionally driven discourses, then they will have stronger arguments and actually be talking about the same thing. On the national level, they should integrate their environmental ministries and just have a ministry for the same thing in each area so that they can more easily collaborate. And on the community level, improve access to open spaces, and also to raise awareness among households about what they can do to protect their environment. So that's it, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.